The Scottsboro Boys Case, a fight for a fair trial. The American South in the early 1900s was a deeply divided place of unimaginable cruelty, where Jim Crow laws dehumanized African Americans purely because of the color of their skin. These laws punished African Americans for the smallest actions, including eating or drinking with a white person, which often resulted in fines, arrests, or even violence. African Americans were also portrayed as dangerous and subhuman, reinforcing racist beliefs and segregation between black and white communities. As a result, it was nearly impossible for African Americans to be treated as equals, especially in the court of law, with the Scottsboro Boys case serving as a tragic example. In 1931, an unfair trial occurred in Scottsboro, Alabama, in which 9 African-American teenagers, later known as the Scottsboro Boys, were wrongfully convicted of rape due to racial bias in court, violating their 6th and 14th Amendment right to an impartial jury. The state of Alabama disregarded its responsibility of providing a fair trial, resulting in 2 of the boys' cases reaching the Supreme Court, in Powell v. Alabama and Norris v. Alabama, helping ensure adequate legal representation and jury selections for future defendants. These pivotal moments, however, resulted from events that unfolded on March 25, 1931 during the height of the Great Depression, when 9 black teenagers boarded a Southern Railroad freight train headed to Memphis, Tennessee. The boys hadn't met before this day, and many of them were traveling in search of work, hoping to better their lives. However, these dreams were shattered when a group of white men started a racially charged altercation with the boys. After the fight escalated, the white men were forced off the train at Paint Rock, Alabama due to their aggressive behaviors. Meanwhile, 2 impoverished white women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, who were facing vagrancy charges, saw an opportunity to protect their reputations by falsely accusing the Scottsboro boys of rape. Aware of the extreme racism in the South, Price and Bates knew their word as white women would be believed over that of the innocent black teenagers. As Clarence Norris, a Scottsboro boy, explained, "I knew if a white woman accused a black man of rape, he was as good as dead. All I could think was I was going to die for something that I had not done." After the women placed their accusations, the boys faced a trial in Scottsboro, Alabama. They were assigned 2 unqualified lawyers, Milo Moody, who hadn't practiced law in decades, and Stephen Roddy, who was unfamiliar with Alabama law. Although the Scottsboro boys were guaranteed the right to legal counsel under the 6th Amendment of the United States Constitution, the law didn't require their representation to be qualified or effective. This loophole allowed Alabama to provide an inadequate legal defense, despite this clearly violating the intent of the amendment. Moreover, Alabama was responsible for upholding the Scottsboro boys' right to due process of law. However, the trial was rushed as it started just 1 week after the boys' indictments, leaving the defense with no time to prepare. Additionally, Alabama selected a jury of exclusively white men, which was almost guaranteed to be biased against the Scottsboro boys due to racial prejudices at the time. As Haywood Patterson, a Scottsboro boy, put it, "The courtroom was one big, smiling, white face." This bias was reflected in the jury's disregard of medical evidence, as Dr. R. Bridges, who inspected the woman for signs of rape, testified that his examination showed little evidence of assault. In addition, the jury's racial bias was further demonstrated by their lack of awareness regarding inconsistent testimonies. The accusers gave 2 completely different descriptions of the event, with Price describing extreme violence and Bates mentioning very little brutality. Despite this, the jury still found all 9 Scottsboro boys guilty, violating the boys' 6th Amendment right to an impartial jury. However, the problem extended far beyond the jury's prejudice, as Alabama was just as responsible for the injustices that the boys faced. By providing a one-sided jury that shockingly sentenced 8 of the 9 innocent Scottsboro boys to death, Alabama failed its 14th Amendment responsibility of providing due process. "Why am I sitting down, thinking of no one but you, Mama? They didn't give me a fair trial. They are going to kill us for nothing." The decision sparked public outcry across the nation, with many people seeing through the true injustices of this initial trial. As a result, 2 organizations, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the International Labor Defense, or ILD for short, were sure that the boys were truly innocent. Driven by their commitment to civil rights, the ILD convinced the boys' parents that they were the right choice and officially took on the case. Soon after, the ILD appointed Samuel Leibowitz, a prominent attorney from New York, to represent the Scottsboro boys. Determined to prove the boys' innocence, Leibowitz and his team appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court, who reluctantly granted another trial, though this new trial remained flawed as the jury's racial bias continued to shine through. Consequently, the ILD appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court once more, but their request was ultimately denied. Still determined after their refusal, the ILD brought the case before the United States Supreme Court in 1932. This proceeding, Powell v. Alabama, ruled that the boys were entitled to a retrial because of Alabama's failure to uphold its responsibility of providing the boys with effective legal counsel. Following this, the third trial of the case ensued, yet it remained extremely similar to the previous ones. However, this time, one of the initial accusers, Ruby Bates, shockingly appeared as a witness for the Scottsboro boys. Bates, feeling guilty for condemning the innocent teenagers, admitted that she had fabricated the entire story. Despite Bates' testimony, the jury, still influenced by racial bias, irresponsibly sentenced some Scottsboro boys to death. As the case dragged on, the constant trials and imprisonment began to affect the boys' mental health, with many boys expressing feelings of hopelessness and despair. As Haywood Patterson famously stated, "This place is killing me. I don't see why we innocent boys should be kept here all this time for nothing." Despite this, the ILD was still persistent in fighting for the boys' rights. They took the case to the United States Supreme Court again, this time to address Alabama's disregard of its 6th and 14th Amendment responsibilities. This ultimately led to the 1935 case, Norris v. Alabama, which granted the Scottsboro boys their 4th and final trial. Increased media attention had pressured the jury to act fairly, resulting in none of the boys receiving the death sentence. By the early 1940s, most Scottsboro boys were released from prison or had reduced charges due to continued public pressure. However, this could never compensate for the over 100 years the boys lost in prison altogether, years they should have spent making the most out of their youth. It wasn't until decades later that the tragedy of the Scottsboro boys was finally acknowledged by Alabama Governor Robert Bentley, who posthumously pardoned the boys in April 2013. This pardon highlighted Alabama's neglected responsibility of providing fair trials and their failure in recognizing their past mistakes. Unfortunately, none of the boys lived to witness this significant moment that truly recognized the injustices they fought through. However, the legacy of the Scottsboro boys case extends beyond just the boys, as it still impacts Americans today. The case reshaped the justice system by establishing new legal protections that ensure the right to a fair trial. For example, Powell v. Alabama clarified that the government is responsible for providing not just any legal defense, but one that is qualified and effective, while Norris v. Alabama established the requirement for racially diverse jury selections to ensure fair trials. Despite these significant legal advancements, however, equality in court is still not fully guaranteed. This is evident in the case of the Central Park Five, a group primarily consisting of African American teenagers who were wrongfully convicted of rape in 1989. The boys were interrogated for hours without their lawyers or parents present, pressuring them into fabricating their confessions despite being completely innocent. In turn, a racially prejudiced jury convicted them based on their clearly coerced statements. The case of the Central Park Five exposes the repeating pattern of systemic racism in the judicial process. Today, African Americans make up about 12% of the United States population, yet they represent 41% of those on death row. Moreover, in 2023, 61% of exonerations involved African Americans, further displaying the extremely disproportionate number of wrongful convictions faced by black people. Because of this, many Americans are concerned about whether the legal system truly serves everyone equally, as in 2024, 51% of the population hold an unfavorable view of the Supreme Court. As a result, Americans must take responsibility in fighting for a more equitable system, with the necessary first step being to actively protest these inequalities. The need to advocate for a fair legal system has been evident for decades, as shown by the Scottsboro boys case, which raised serious questions about the integrity of the judicial process. The injustices of the first trial led to 3 subsequent trials to unfold, yet the core issues, specifically racial discrimination, remained unchanged. For the Scottsboro boys, the case was a fight for survival. However, its legacy stretches far beyond the boys' personal experiences. Instead, the case left a lasting impact on the justice system, sparking numerous legal advancements and ultimately becoming a true fight for a fair trial.